Hey everybody, it's Rafi at Zurb, and in this video I'm going to take you through the range slider component that's in Foundation. So if you need to make something that is a range slider, something like this, where you can drag the handle back and forth and set a value, then this is built into Foundation. So you can use a range slider this way where it has a draggable handle, and on mobile it works the same way, so you would touch on the slider handle and move the slider around. And this has an input type that produces a number as well, so it could be used in many different configurations, including two handles, but also with some data binding that's documented here. So we have a range slider that is now connected to some data. As you can see, the number is growing and shrinking as I slide the handle around. So let's take a look at an example of this component in real code. So we have our div with a class of slider, and the data-slider data attribute is important to tell the JavaScript that this is going to be a range slider. And then there's some data attributes that you can add to this component to set it up. So data-initial start, obviously that's where the range handle will start. So if we set this at 50, then it's going to be 50 out of data-end 200. So you can see that data-end is set to 200, so this is actually 50 out of 200. Now if I change this total value, let's say it's 100, that's pretty typical, then you can see that 50 is actually halfway through the range of this range slider. So this initial start is where you can set where the slider handle starts, and the data-end is the total amount for the slider. So if we made this 500, you could see that the 50 is now only 10% of this range slider. So you can adjust those to work with whatever data that you need to present and allow users to work through. So the slider handle class that's on this span is what actually controls the styles for this blue box here, which is the slider handle. And this is what could be dragged back and forth. So if you want to change the way it looks, you could just target the slider handle. Data-slider handle, obviously that tells us JavaScript like, hey, this is the slider handle, and look for touch events and look for its position to report what value it's on currently. And the slider fill is what you actually see here, this bar. So that those styles can also be controlled with the slider fill class. Now we can also make this slider vertical by adding the vertical class to the slider. Okay, and that makes the slider vertical. We also want to do one more thing, which is add a data attribute, data-vertical equals true. And this is going to initialize the JavaScript to know that now this is a vertical slider, and it's going to look for drag and touch events in the Y direction. So this sets it up correctly. So to make it vertical, you add the vertical class and data-vertical equals true. Now all these data attributes are things that are on the documentation page. So let me show you where they are. So you know that there's lots of different options and configurations that you could do with this component. It does use JavaScript, so there's lots of JavaScript data options that you can apply to it. So data-start, data-end, we covered those. And data-step allows you to set a stepped range. So if you want to perhaps step somebody through 1 through 10 or something like that, you can use the range slider for that. So there's lots of different data attributes that you can find on the documentation. It's under plugin options. And now we're going to jump into a couple more advanced configurations. Okay, so one of the more advanced configurations is to add data binding to this. So not only is this range slider reporting an output over to this input type number box over here, but you can actually use the input type number box to set the value, and the range slider will react to it. So let's set that to like 34, which in this case is 34 out of 100, 34%. And that also brings up an interesting thing, that if you don't set up a data-end attribute, that it'll default to 100. That makes sense because it's 100% or 1 out of 100 or whatever different types of ratios. 100 is pretty typical. So when we want to set this up to have data binding, the only thing we really need to do is to make sure that we have an ID for our input type number. So we're using an input type number, as you can see here, and that just makes sure that the ID is attached to this data, to this slider. So the ID is actually set up on the handle. So as you can see here, we have our span with the class of slider handle. And if we look down here, we have aria controls equals slider output 1. So this is using one of the aria accessibility features built into the browser, and it actually reports the current value of the range slider handle, which is great because it's all native stuff, so it's going to work correctly. And as long as this ID matches the ID over here in this input type number, they're going to be attached to each other and work correctly. The foundation JavaScript takes care of the rest. So as I increment this input type number, you can see that the range handle is adjusting properly. As I increase and decrease the range handle manually, you can see that the input type number is being adjusted. So another interesting thing too is that this input type number that is being used here is actually the best way to set up a range slider for accessibility. So if you're coding for somebody that's using a screen reader, it's important that they can access the content in this range slider. And they can do that if it has this input type number to report the current value. And then this is also, it's an input, so it's something that they can manipulate using their keyboard controls. So what you would do is actually set your range slider up this way and use an accessibility property or one of Foundation's visibility classes to actually hide this visually but show it for a screen reader. So that's another interesting use case for this data binding version of the range slider. And now we're going to jump into a two-handle range slider. Okay, and then another advanced configuration is having a range slider that has two handles on the same range slider. So there might be times where you want to bind two different types of data and compare them. So this is really typical for like pricing. You can set a min price and a max price or something like that. So you can set your component up with a div with the class of slider, data-slider attribute, and then data-initial start, data-initial end. So all the data attributes that we've already been using. So the only difference really is that we're going to have two slider handles. So you still have one slider fill, but you have two slider handles. They're on either side here of this slider fill, as you can see in the code here. So one of them is going to be the one that's on the left, and one of them is going to be the one that's on the right, and that is actually determined by its order in the code. So the one on the left is actually the one that's first in code. And then we'll have two input type hiddens here, and they're just going to hide the default range slider that the browser creates. So this is how you could set up a dual handle range slider, and you can set it up with the data binding as well, just like you would on a single one. And now you have two controls to compare values. So moving back to the documentation, there's also a native range slider, which I just mentioned. So this is actually built into browsers now, and the browser compatibility is pretty good. So you could check that out. We have a link here to the browser compatibility. It's not fully supported in every browser or like the older like IE8s and IE9s, but I believe IE10 and up, it is supported. So this is something that, you know, is on the horizon and you can start using it. And then there's other configurations here, as you can see in the docs. Also, a reflow procedure here if you ever need to reinitialize this component. If, let's say, you load it in after the page loads through Ajax or something like that, the reflow property here will help you do that. You have a few Sass variables that you can adjust in the settings file. And you can actually use this component with Sass mixins, so you can create the styles with your own custom classes. You don't need to use Foundation's classes. And then in your custom class, you would just include slider container, slider fill, and slider handle. And of course the JavaScript reference, which I mentioned before, the plugin options. So take a look through this. You have tons of options here to really configure this component the way that you want and really make it work the way that you need. So lots of different options there. I would look here first if you were going to do something more custom than the basic doc version. So that is the Foundation range slider. Lots of cool stuff. And if you guys are looking for a deeper dive into Foundation and want to learn all the components, make sure you check out our Intro to Foundation class. I'll shoot the link below. Thanks.